Chapter 56 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daisy 55. Lorna Doone by R. D. Blackmore. Chapter 56. John becomes too popular. No flower that I have ever seen, either in shifting of light and shade, or in the pearly morning, may vie with a fair young woman's face when tender thought and quick emotions vary, enrich, and beautify it. Thus my Lorna hearkened softly, almost without word or gesture, yet with sighs and glances telling, in the pressure of my hand, how each word was moving her. When at last my tale was done, she turned away and wept bitterly for the sad fate of her parents. But to my surprise she spoke not even a word of wrath or rancour. She seemed to take it all as fate. "Lorna, darling," I said at length, for men are more impatient in trials of time than women are, "do you not wish to know what your proper name is?" "How can it matter to me, John?" she answered, with a depth of grief which made me seem a trifler. "It can never matter now, when there are none to share it." "Poor little soul," was all I said, in a tone of purest pity; and to my surprise she turned upon me, caught me in her arms, and loved me as she had never done before. "Dearest, I have you," she cried; "you, and only you, love. Having you, I want no other. All my life is one with yours. Oh, John, how can I treat you so?" Blushing through the web of weeping, and the gloom of pondering, yet she would not hide her eyes, but folded me and dwelled on me. "I cannot believe it, in the pride of my joy," I whispered into one little ear, "that you could ever so love me, beauty, as to give up the world for me." "Would you give up your farm for me, John?" cried Lorna, leaping back and looking with her wondrous power of light at me. "Would you give up your mother, your sisters, your home, and all that you have in the world, and every hope in your life, John?" "Of course I would, without two thoughts. You know it, Lorna." "It is true that I do," she answered in a tone of deepest sadness; "and it is this power of your love which has made me love you so. No good can come of it, no good. God's face is set against selfishness." As she spoke in that low tone, I gazed at the clear lines of her face, where every curve was perfect, not with love and wonder only, but with a strange new sense of awe. "Darling," I said, "come nearer to me. Give me surety against that. For God's sake, never frighten me with the thought that He would part us." "Does it then so frighten you?" she whispered, coming close to me. "I know it, dear. I have known it long. But it never frightens me, and makes me sad and very lonely, till I can remember." "Till you can remember what?" I asked, with a long deep shudder, for we are so superstitious. "Until I do remember, love, that you will soon come back to me, and be my own for ever. This is what I always think of, this is what I hope for." Although her eyes were so glorious and beaming with eternity, this distant sort of beatitude was not much to my liking. I wanted to have my love on earth, and my dear wife in my own home, and children in good time, if God should please to send us any. And then I would be to them exactly what my father was to me. And besides all this, I doubted much about being fit for heaven, where no ploughs are, and no cattle, unless sacrificed bulls went thither. Therefore I said, "Now kiss me, Lorna, and don't talk any nonsense." And the darling came and did it, being kindly obedient, as the other world often makes us. Your sweet love, I said at this, being slave to her soft obedience. Do you suppose I should be content to leave you until Elsum? How on earth can I tell, dear John, what we'll be content with? You and only you, said I. The whole of lies in a syllable. Now you know my entire want, and what must be my comfort. But surely if I have money, sir, and birth, and rank, and all sorts of grandeur, you would never dare to think of me? She drew herself up with an air of pride, as she gravely pronounced these words, and gave me a scornful glance, or tried, and turned away as if to enter some grand coach or palace, while I was so amazed and grieved in my raw simplicity, especially after the way in which she had first received my news, so loving and warm-hearted, that I never said a word, but stared and thought, how does she mean it? She saw the pain upon my forehead, and the wonder in my eyes, and leaving coach and palace too, back she flew to me in a moment, as simplest milkmaid. Oh, you fearful stupid John, you inexpressibly stupid John, she cried with both arms around my neck, and her lips upon my forehead. You have called yourself thick-headed, John, and I never would believe it. But now I do with all my heart. Will you never know what I am, love? No, Lorna, that I never shall. I can understand my mother well, and one at least of my sisters, and both the Snow's girls very easily. But you I never understood, only love you all the more for it. Then never try to understand me, if the result is that, dear John. And yet I am the very simplest of all foolish simple creatures. Nay, I am wrong. Therein I yield the palm to you, my dear. To think that I can act so. No wonder they want me in London, as an ornament for the stage, John. Now in after days, when I heard of Lorna as the richest and noblest and loveliest lady to be found in London, I often remembered that little scene, and recalled every word and gesture, wondering what lay under it. Even now, while it was quite impossible once to doubt those clear deep eyes, and the bright lips trembling so, nevertheless I felt how much the world would have to do with it, and that the best and truest people cannot shake themselves quite free. However, for the moment I was very proud, and showed it. And herein differs fact from fancy. Things as they befall us from things as we would have them. Human ends from human hopes. That the first are moved by 1,000, and the last on 2 wheels only, which, being named, are desire and fear. Hope, of course, is nothing more than desire with a telescope, magnifying distant matters, overlooking near ones, opening one eye on the objects, closing the other to all objections. And if hope be the future tense of desire, the future of fear is religion, at least with too many of us. Whether I am right or wrong in these small moralities, one thing is sure enough, to wit, that hope is the fastest traveller, at any rate, in the time of youth. And so I hoped that Lorna might be proved of blameless family, and honourable rank and fortune, and yet none the less for that, love me and belong to me. So I led her into the house, and she fell into my mother's arms, and I left them to have a good cry of it, with Annie ready to help them. If Master Stickles should not mend enough to gain his speech a little, and declare to us all he knew, I was to set out for Watchet, riding upon horseback, and there to hire a cart with wheels, such as we had not begun, as yet, to use on Exmoor. For all our work went on board wood, with runners and with earth boards, and many of us still looked upon wheels, though mentioned in the Bible, as the invention of the evil one, and Pharaoh's especial property. Now, instead of getting better, Colonel Stickles grew worse and worse, in spite of all our tenderness to him, with simples and with nourishment, and no poisonous medicine such as doctors would have given him. And the fault of this lay not with us, but purely with himself and his unquiet constitution, for he roused himself up to a perfect fever, when through Lizzie's giddiness he learned the very thing which mother and Annie were hiding from him, with the utmost care, namely, that Sergeant Bloxham had taken upon himself to send direct to London by the Chancery officers a full report of what had happened, and of the illness of his chief, together with an urgent prayer for a full battalion of King's troops, and a plenary commander. This Sergeant Bloxham, being senior of the surviving soldiers, and a very worthy man in his way, but a trifle overzealous, had succeeded to the captaincy upon his master's disablement. Then, with desire to serve his country and show his education, he sat up most part of 3 nights, and wrote this wonderful report by the aid of our stable lanthorn. It was a very fine piece of work, as 3 men to whom he read it, but only one at a time, pronounced, being under seal of secrecy. And all might have gone well with it, if the author could only have held his tongue, when near the ears of women. But this was beyond his sense, as it seems, although so good a writer. For having heard that our Lizzie was a famous judge of literature, as indeed she told almost every one, he could not contain himself, but must have her opinion upon his work. Lizzie sat on a log of wood, and listened with all her ears up, having made proviso that no one else should be there to interrupt her. And she put in a syllable here and there, and many a time she took out one, for the sergeant overloaded his gun more often than undercharged it, like a liberal man of letters. And then she declared the result so good, so chaste, and the style to be so elegant, and yet so fervent, that the sergeant broke his pipe in 3, and fell in love with her on the spot. Now this has led me out of the way, as things are always done, partly through their own perverseness, partly through my kind desire to give fair turn to all of them, and to all the people who do them. If any one expects of me a strict and well-drilled story, standing at attention all the time, with hands at the side like 2 wings on my trunk, and eyes going neither right nor left, I trow that man has been disappointed many a page ago, and has left me to my evil ways, and if not, I love his charity. Therefore let me seek his grace, and get back, and just begin again. That great dispatch was sent to London by the Chancery officers, whom we fitted up with clothes, and for 3 days fattened them, which in strict justice they needed much, as well as in point of equity. They were kind enough to be pleased with us, and accepted my new shirts generously, and urgent as their business was, another week, as they both declared, could do no harm to nobody, and might set them upon their legs again. And knowing, although they were London men, that fish do live in water, these 2 fellows went fishing all day, but never landed anything. However, their holiday was cut short, for the sergeant, having finished now his narrative of proceedings, was not the man to let it hang fire, and be quenched perhaps by Stickles. Therefore, having done their business, and served both citations, these 2 good men had a pannier of victuals put up by dear Annie, and borrowing 2 of our horses, rode to Dunster, where they left them, and hired on towards London. We had not time to like them much, and so we did not miss them, especially in our great anxiety about poor Master Stickles. Jeremy lay between life and death for at least a fortnight. If the link of chain had flown upwards, for half a link of chain it was which took him in the mouth so, even 1 inch upwards, the poor man could have needed no more except Parson Bowden, for the bottom of his skull, which holds the brain as in the egg cup, must have clean gone from him, but striking him horizontally and a little upon the skew, the metal came out at the back of his neck, and the powder not being strong, I suppose, it lodged in his leather collar. Now the rust of this iron hung in the wound, or at least we thought so, though since I have talked with a man of medicine, I am not so sure of it, and our chief aim was to purge this rust, when rather we should have stopped the hole, and let the oxide do its worst, with a plug of new flesh on both sides of it. At last I prevailed upon him by argument that he must get better, to save himself from being ignobly and unjustly superseded, and hereupon I reviled Sergeant Bloxham more fiercely than Jeremy's self could have done, and indeed to such a pitch that Jeremy almost forgave him, and became much milder; and after that his fever and the inflammation of his wound diminished very rapidly. However, not knowing what might happen, or even how soon poor Lorna might be taken from our power, and, falling into lawyers' hands, have cause to wish herself most heartily back among the robbers, I set forth one day for Watchet, taking advantage of the visits of some troopers from an outpost, who would make our house quite safe. I rode alone, being fully primed, and having no misgivings. For it was said that even the Doones had begun to fear me, since I cast their culverin through the door, as above related, and they could not believe, but from my being still untouched, although so large an object, in the thickest of their fire, both of gun and cannon, that I must bear a charmed life, proof against ball and bullet. However, I knew that Carver Doone was not a likely man to hold any superstitious opinions, and of him I had an instinctive dread, although quite ready to face him. Riding along, I meditated upon Lorna's history. How many things were now beginning to unfold themselves, which had been obscure and dark. For instance, Sir Ensor Doone's consent, or to say the least his indifference, to her marriage to a yeoman, which in a man so proud, though dying, had greatly puzzled both of us. But now, if she not only proved to be no grandchild of the Doone, but even descended from his enemy, it was natural enough that he should feel no great repugnance to her humiliation, and that Lorna's father had been a foe to the house of Doone, I gathered from her mother's cry, when she beheld the leader. Moreover, the fact would supply their motive in carrying off the unfortunate little creature, and rearing her among them, and as one of their own family, yet hiding her true birth from her. She was a great card, as we say, when playing all fours at Christmas time, and if one of them could marry her, before she learned of right and wrong, vast property, enough to buy pardons for 1,000 Doones, would be at their mercy. And since I was to come to know Lorna better, and she to know me thoroughly, many things had been outspoken, which her early bashfulness had kept covered from me. Attempts, I mean, to pledge her love to this one, or that other, some of which perhaps might have been successful, if there had not been too many. And then, as her beauty grew richer and richer, Carver Doone was smitten strongly, and would hear of no one else as a suitor for her, and by the terror of his claim drove off all the others. Here too made the explanation of a thing which seemed to be against the laws of human nature, and upon which I longed, but dared not to cross-question Lorna. How could such a lovely girl, although so young and brave, and distant, have escaped the vile affections of a lawless company? But now it was as clear as need be, for any proven violence would have utterly vitiated all claim upon her grand estate, at least as those claims must be urged before a court of equity, and therefore all the elders with views upon her real estate kept strict watch on the youngers, who confirmed their views to her personality. Now I do not mean to say that all this, or the 100 other things which came, crowding consideration, were half as plain to me at the time as I have set them down above. Far be it from me to deceive you so. No doubt my thoughts were then dark and hazy, like an old lamp full of fungus, and I have trimmed them, as when they burned, with scissors sharpened long afterwards. All I mean to say is this, that jogging along to a certain tune of the horse's feet, which we call 3 halfpence and 2 pence, I saw my way a little into some things which had puzzled me. When I knocked at the little door, whose sill was gritty and grimed with sand, no one came for a very long time to answer me, or to let me in. Not wishing to be unmannerly, I waited a long time, and watched the sea, from which the wind was blowing, and whose many lifts of waves thought the tide was half way out, spoke to and refreshed me. After a while I knocked again, for my horse was becoming hungry, and a good while after that again, a voice came through the keyhole. "Who is that wishes to enter?" "The boy who was at the pump," said I, "when the carriage broke down at Doveriton. The boy that lives at and some day you will come to seek him?" "Oh yes, I remember certainly. My little boy with the fair white skin. I have desired to see him, many times." She was opening the door while saying this, and then she started back in affright that the little boy should have grown so. "You cannot be that little boy. It is quite impossible. Why do you impose on me?" "Not only am I that little boy, who made the water to flow for you, till the nibleu came upon the glass, but also I come to tell you about your little girl." "Come in, you very great little boy," she answered, with her dark eyes brightened, and I went in, and looked at her. She was altered by time as much as I was. The slight and graceful shape was gone. Not that I remembered anything of her figure, if you please, for boys of 12 are not yet prone to note the shapes of women, but that her lithe straight gait had struck me as being so unlike our people. Now her time for walking was so past, and transmitted to her children, yet her face was comely still, and full of strong intelligence. I gazed at her, and she at me, and we were sure of one another. "Now, what will you please to eat?" she asked, with a lively glance at the size of my mouth. "That is always the first thing you people ask, in these barbarous places." "I will tell you by and by," I answered, misliking this satire upon us; "but I might begin with a quart of ale, to enable me to speak, madam." "Very well. 1 quarter of beer," she called out to a little maid, who was the eldest child, no doubt. "It is to be expected, sir. Beer, all day long with you Englishmen." "Nay," I replied, "not all day long, if madam will excuse me. Only a pint at breakfast time, and a pint and a half at 11 o'clock, and a quart or so at dinner. And then no more till the afternoon, and half a gallon at supper time. No one can object to that." "Well, I suppose it is right," she said, with an air of resignation. "God knows, but I do not understand it. It is good for business, as you say, to preclude everything." "And it is good for us, madam," I answered with indignation, "for beer is my favourite beverage, and I am a credit to beer, madam, and so are all who trust it."
At any rate, you are, young man. If beer has made you grow so large, I will put my children upon it. It is too late for me to begin. The smell of me is hateful." Now, I only set down that to show how perverse those foreign people are. They will drink their wretched, heartless stuff, such as they call claret, or wine, or Medoc, or Bordeaux, or what not, with no more meaning than sour rennet, stirred with the pulp from the cider press, and strained through the cap of our Betty. This is very well for them, and as good as they deserve, no doubt, and meant perhaps by the will of God, for those unhappy natives. But to bring it over to England and set it against our home brew ale, not to speak of wines from Portugal, and sell it at 10 times the price, as a cure for British bile and a great enlightenment, this I say is the vilest feature of the age we live in. Madame Benita O'Dam, for the name of the man who turned the wheel proved to be John O'Dam, showed me into a little room containing 2 chairs and a fir wood table, and sat down on a 3-legged seat and studied me very steadfastly. This she had a right to do, and I, having all my clothes on, was not disconcerted. It could not become me to repeat her judgment upon my appearance, which she delivered as calmly as if I were a pig in market, and as proud as if her own pig. And she asked me whether I had ever got rid of the black marks on my breast. Not wanting to talk about myself, though very proud of doing so when time and season favored, I led her back to that fearful night of the day when first I had seen her. She was not desirous to speak of, because of her own little children. However, I drew her gradually to the recollection of Lorna, and then of the little boy who died, and the poor mother buried with him. And her strong, hot nature kindled, as she dwelled upon these things, and my wrath waxed within me, and we forgot reserve and prudence under the sense of so vile a wrong. She told me, as nearly as might be, the very same story which she had told to Master Jeremy Stickles, only she dwelt upon it more, because of my knowing the onset, and being a woman with an inkling for my situation, she enlarged upon the little maid more than to dry Jeremy. "Would you know her again?" I asked, being stirred by these accounts of Lorna when she was 5 years old. "Would you know her as a full-grown maiden?" "I think I should," she answered. "It is not possible to say until one sees the person, but from the eyes of the little girl, I think that I must know her. Oh, the poor young creature! Is it to be believed that the cannibals devoured her? What a people you are in this country! Meat, meat, meat!" As she raised her hands and eyes in horror at our carnivorous propensities, to which she clearly attributed the disappearance of Lorna, I could scarcely help laughing, even after that sad story. For though it is said at the present day, and will doubtless be said hereafter, that the Doones had devoured a baby once, as they came upon Porlock Hill, after fighting hard in the marketplace, I knew that the tale was utterly false, for cruel and brutal as they were, their taste was very correct and choice, and indeed one might say fastidious. Nevertheless, I could not stop to argue that matter with her. "The little maid has not been devoured," I said to Mistress O'Dam, "and now she is a tall young lady, and as beautiful as can be. If I sleep in your good hostel to night after going to Watchett town, will you come with me to Old to morrow, and see your little maiden?" "I would like, and yet I fear. This country is so barbarous, and I am good to eat. My God, there is much picking on my bones." She surveyed herself with a glance so mingled of pity and admiration, and the truth of her words was so apparent. only that it would have taken a week to get at the bones before picking, that I nearly lost good manners, for she really seemed to suspect even me of cannibal inclination. However, at last I made her promise to come with me on the morrow, presuming that Master Odam could by any means be persuaded to keep her company in the cart, as propriety demanded. Having little doubt that Master Odam was entirely at his wife's command, I looked upon that matter as settled, and set off for Watchett to see the grave of Lorna's poor mother, and to hire a cart for the morrow. And hence, as so often happens with men, I succeeded without any trouble or hindrance, where I had looked for both of them, namely, in finding a suitable cart, whereas the other matter, in which I could have expected no difficulty, came very near to defeat me. For when I heard that Lorna's father was the Earl of Doone, as Benita impressed upon me with a strong enforcement, as much as to say, "Who are you, young man, to come even asking about her?" then I never thought but that everybody in Watchett town must know all about the tombstones of the Countess of Doone. However, proved otherwise, for Lord Doone had never lived at Watchett Grange, as their place was called, neither had his name become familiar as its owner, because the Grange had only devolved to him by will, at the end of a long entail, when the last of the Fitzpaines died out; and though he liked the idea of it, he had gone abroad without taking citizen, and upon news of his death, John Jones, a rich gentleman from Llandaff, had taken possession, as next of right, and hushed up all the story. And though even at the worst of times a lady of high rank and wealth could not be robbed, and as bad as murdered, and then buried in a little place without moving some excitement, yet had been given out, on purpose and with diligence, that this was only a foreign lady travelling for her health and pleasure, along the sea coast of England. And as the poor thing never spoke, and several of her servants and her baggage looked so foreign, and she herself died in a collar of lace unlike any made in England, all Watchett, without hesitation, pronounced her to be a foreigner. And an English serving man and maid, who might have cleared up everything, either was bribed by Master Jones, or else decamped of their own accord with the relics of the baggage. So the poor Countess of Doone, almost in sight of her own grand house, was buried in an unknown grave, with her pair of infants, without a plate, without a tombstone, worse than all, without a tear, except from the hired Italian woman. Surely my poor Lorna came of an ill-starred family. Now, in spite of all this, if I had only taken Benita with me, or even told her what I wished, and craved her directions, there could have been no trouble. But I do assure you that among the stupid people at Watchett, compared with whom our folk of Orrery, exceedingly dense though being, are as hamlets against Dogberry, what with one of them and another, and a firm conviction of all the town that I could become only to wrestle, I do assure you, as I said before, that my wits almost went out of me. And what vexed me yet more about it, was that I saw my own mistake, in coming myself to seek out the matter, instead of sending some unknown person. For my face and form were known at that time, and still are so, to 9 people out of every 10 living in 40 miles of me. Not through any excellence, or anything of good desert, in either the one or the other, but simply because folks will be fools on the rivalry of wrestling. The art is a fine one in itself, and demands a little wit of brain, as well as strength of body. It binds the man who studies it to temperance, and chastity, to self-respect, and most of all to an even and sweet temper. For I have thrown stronger men than myself, when I was a mere sapling, and before my strength grew hard on me, through their loss of temper. But though the art is an honest one, surely they who excel therein have a right, like all the rest of mankind, to their own private life. Be that way either, and I will not speak too strongly, for fear of indulging my own annoyance. Anyhow, all Whitchett town cared 10 times as much to see John Ridd as to show him what he wanted. I was led to every public house, instead of to the churchyard, and 20 tables were ready for me, in lieu of a single gravestone. Zumazet thou beest, John Ridd, and Zumazet that shall be. They call thee Zell a Devonshire man, who they lives in Zumazet, and in Zumazet thee wast a born lad. And so it went on, till I was weary, though very much obliged to them. Dull and solid as I am, and with a wild duck waiting for me at good Mistress O'Dam's, I saw that there was nothing for it but to yield to these good people, and prove me a man of Somerset by eating a dinner at their expense. As for the churchyard, none would hear of it, and I grieved for broaching the matter. But how was I to meet Lorna again, without having done the thing of all things which I had promised to see to? It would never do to tell her that so great was my popularity, and so strong the desire to feed me, that I could not attend to her mother. Least of all could I say that every one in Watchet knew John Ridd, while none had heard of the Countess of Dougal. And yet that was about the truth, as I hinted very delicately to Mistress O'Dam that evening. But she, being vexed about her wild duck, and not having English ideas on the matter of sport, and so on, made a poor unwitting face at me. Nevertheless, Master O'Dam restored me to my self-respect, for he stared at me till I went to bed, and he broke his nose with excitement. For being in the leg line myself, I wanted to know what the muscles were of a man who turned a wheel all day. I had never seen a treadmill, though they have one now in Exeter, and it touched me much to learn whether it was good exercise. And herein, from what I saw of O'Dam, I incline to think that it does great harm, as moving the muscles too much in a line, and without, and definitely without variety. End of chapter 56. Recording by Daisy 55.
Chapter 57 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 57. Lorna Knows Her Nurse. Having obtained from Benita Odom a very close and full description of the place where her poor mistress lay, and the marks whereby to know it, I hastened to Watchet the following morning, before the sun was up or any people were about; and so, without interruption, I was in the churchyard at sunrise. In the farthest and darkest nook, overgrown with grass, and overhung by a weeping tree, a little bank of earth betokened the rounding off of a hapless life. There was nothing to tell of rank, or wealth, of love, or even pity. Nameless as a peasant lay the last, as supposed, of a mighty race. Only some unskilful hand, probably Master Odom's under his wife's teaching, had carved a rude L, and a ruder D, upon a large pebble from the beach, and set it up as a headstone. I gathered a little grass for Lorna, and a sprig of the weeping tree, and then returned to the Forest Cat, as Benita's lonely inn was called. For the way is long from Watchet to Oare, and though you may ride it rapidly, as the Doones had done on that fatal night, to travel on wheels, with one horse only, is a matter of time and of prudence. Therefore we set out pretty early, 3 of us and a baby, who could not well be left behind. The wife of the man who owned the cart had undertaken to mind the business and the other babies, upon condition of having the keys of all the taps left with her. As the manner of journeying over the moor has been described oft enough already, I will say no more, except that we all arrived before dusk of the summer's day, safe at Plover's Barrows. Mistress Benita was delighted with the change from her dull hard life, and she made many excellent observations, such as seem natural to a foreigner looking at our country. As luck would have it, the first who came to meet us at the gate was Lorna, with nothing whatever upon her head, the weather being summerly, but her beautiful hair shed round her, and wearing a sweet white frock tucked in, and showing her figure perfectly. In her joy she ran straight up to the cart, and then stopped and gazed at Benita. At one glance her old nurse knew her. "Oh, the eyes!" she cried, and was over the rail of the cart in a moment, in spite of all her substance. Lorna, on the other hand, looked at her with some doubt and wonder, as though having right to know much about her, and yet unable to do so. But when the foreign woman said something in Roman language, and flung new hay from the cart upon her, as if in a romp of childhood, the young maid cried, "Oh, Nita, Nita!" and fell upon her breast and wept, and after that looked round at us. This being so, there could be no doubt as to the power of proving Lady Lorna's birth and rights, both by evidence and token. For though we had not the necklace now, thanks to Annie's wisdom, we had the ring of heavy gold, a very ancient relic, with which my maid, in her simple way, had pledged herself to me. And Benita knew this ring as well as she knew her own fingers, having heard a long history about it, and the effigy on it of the wild cat was the bearing of the house of Lorne. For though Lorna's father was a nobleman of high and goodly lineage, her mother was of yet more ancient and renowned descent, being the last in line direct from the great and kingly chiefs of Lorne. A wild and headstrong race they were, and must have everything their own way. Hot blood was ever among them, even of one household, and their sovereignty, which more than once had defied the King of Scotland, waned and fell among themselves by continual quarrelling. And it was of a piece with this that the Doones, who were an offset, by the mother's side, holding in co-partnership some large property, which had come by the spindle, as we say, should fall out with the Earl of Lorne, the last but one of that title. The daughter of this nobleman had married Sir Ensor Doone, but this, instead of healing matters, led to fiercer conflict. I never could quite understand all the ins and outs of it, which none but a lawyer may go through and keep his head at the end of it. The motives of mankind are plainer than the motions they produce, especially when charity, such as found among us, sits to judge the former, and is never weary of it, while reason does not care to trace the latter complications, except for fee or title. Therefore it is enough to say, that knowing Lorna to be direct in heirship to vast property, and bearing especial spite against the house of which she was the last, the Doones had brought her up with full intention of lawful marriage, and had carefully secluded her from the wildest of their young gallants. Of course, if they had been next in succession, the child would have gone down the waterfall, to save any further trouble. But there was an intercepting branch of some honest family, and they being outlaws would have a poor chance, though the law loves outlaws, against them. Only Lorna was of the stock, and Lorna they must marry. And what a triumph against the old Earl, for a cursed Doone to succeed him. As for their outlawry, great robberies, and grand murders, the veriest child, nowadays, must know that money heals the whole of that. Even if they had murdered people of a good position, it would only cost about twice as much to prove their motives loyal. But they had never slain any man above the rank of yeoman, and folk even said that my father was the highest of their victims, for the death of Lorna's mother and brother was never set to their account. Pure pleasure it is to any man to reflect upon all these things. How truly we discern clear justice, and how well we deal it. If any poor man steals a sheep, having 10 children starving, and regarding it as mountain game, as a rich man does a hare, to the gallows with him. If a man of rank beats down a door, smites the owner upon the head, and honours the wife with attention, it is a thing to be grateful for, and to slouch smitten head the lower. While we were full of these things, and wondering what would happen next, or what we ought ourselves to do, another very important matter called for our attention. This was no less than Annie's marriage to the Squire Faggus. We had tried to put it off again, for in spite of all advantages, neither my mother nor myself had any real heart for it. Not that we dwelled upon Tom's shortcomings, or rather perhaps his going too far, at the time when he worked the road so. All that was covered by the King's pardon, and universal respect of the neighbourhood. But our scruple was this, and the more we talked the more it grew upon us, that we both had great misgivings as to his future steadiness. For it would be 1,000 pities, we said, for a fine, well-grown, and pretty maiden, such as our Annie was, useful too in so many ways, and lively and warm-hearted, and mistress of £500, to throw herself away on a man with a kind of a turn for drinking. If that last were even hinted, Annie would be most indignant, and ask, with cheeks as red as roses, who had ever seen Master Faggus any the worse for liquor and meat. Her own opinion was, in truth, that he took a great deal too little, after all his hard work and hard riding, and coming over the hills to be insulted. And if ever it lay in her power, and with no one to grudge him his trumpery glass, she would see that poor Tom had the nourishment which his cough and his lungs required. His lungs being quite as sound as mine, this matter was out of all argument. So mother and I looked at one another, as much as to say, let her go upstairs, she will cry and come down more reasonable. And while she was gone, we used to say the same thing over and over again, but without perceiving a cure for it. And we almost always finished up with the following reflection, which sometimes came from mother's lips and sometimes from my own. Well, well, there is no telling. None can say how a man may alter when he takes to matrimony. But if we could only make Annie promise to be a little firm with him. I fear that all this talk on our part only hurried matters forward, Annie being more determined every time we pitied her. And at last Tom Faggus came, and spoke as if he were on the King's road, with a pistol at my head and one at mother's. "No more fast and loose," he cried, "either one thing or the other. I love the maid, and she loves me, and we will have one another, either with your leave or without it. How many more times am I to dance over these vile hills, and leave my business, and get nothing more than a sigh or a kiss, and 'Tom, I must wait for mother'? You are famous for being straightforward, you Ridds. Just treat me as I would treat you now." I looked at my mother, for a glance from her would have sent Tom out of the window, but she checked me with her hand, and said, "You have some ground of complaint, sir, I will not deny it. Now I will be as straightforward with you as even a Ridd is supposed to be. My son and myself have all along disliked your marriage with Annie. Not for what you have been so much, as for what we fear you will be. Have patience one moment, if you please. We do not fear your taking to the highway life again, for that you are too clever, no doubt, now that you have property. But we fear that you will take to drinking, and to squandering money. There are many examples of this around us, and we know what the fate of the wife is. It has been hard to tell you this, under our own roof, and with our own—" Here mother hesitated. "Spirits and cider and beer," I broke in. "Out with it, like a Ridd, mother, as he will have all of it." "Spirits and cider and beer," said mother very firmly after me, and then she gave way and said, "You know, Tom, you are welcome to every drop and more of it." Now Tom must have had a far sweeter temper than ever I could claim, for I should have thrust my glass away, and never have taken another drop in the house where such a check had met me. But instead of that, Master Faggus replied, with a pleasant smile, "I know that I am welcome, good mother, and to prove it, I will have some more." And thereupon he mixed himself another glass of Hollands with lemon and hot water, yet pouring it very delicately. "Oh, I have been so miserable! Take a little more, Tom," said mother, handing the bottle. "Yes, take a little more," I said. "You have mixed it over weak, Tom." "If ever there was a sober man," cried Tom, complying with our request, "if ever there was in Christendom a man of perfect sobriety, that man is now before you. Shall we say to morrow week, mother? It will suit your washing day." "How very thoughtful you are, Tom. Now John would never have thought of that, in spite of all his steadiness." "Certainly not," I answered proudly. "When my time comes for Lorna, I shall not study Betty Muxworthy." In this way the Squire got over us, and Farmer Nicholas Snowe was sent for, to counsel with mother about the matter, and to set his two daughters sewing. When the time for the wedding came, there was such a stir and commotion as had never been known in the parish of Oare since my father's marriage. For Annie's beauty and kindliness had made her the pride of the neighbourhood; and the presents sent her, from all around, were enough to stock a shop with. Master Stickles, who could now walk, and who certainly owed his recovery, with the blessing of God, to Annie, presented her with a mighty Bible, silver clasped, and very handsome, beating the parson's out and out, and for which he had sent to Taunton. Even the common troopers, having tasted her cookery many times, to help out their poor rations, clubbed together, and must have given at least a week's pay apiece, to have turned out what they did for her. This was no less than a silver pot, well designed, but suited surely rather to the bridegroom's taste than bride's. In a word, everybody gave her things. And now my Lorna came to me, with a spring of tears in appealing eyes, for she was still somewhat childish, or rather I should say more childish now than when she lived in misery; and she placed her little hand in mine, and she was half afraid to speak, and dropped her eyes for me to ask. "What is it, little darling?" I asked, as I saw her breath come fast, for the smallest emotion moved her form. "You don't think, John, you don't think, dear, that you could lend me any money?" "All I have got," I answered. "How much do you want, dear heart?" "I have been calculating, and I fear that I cannot do any good with less than £10, John." Here she looked up at me with horror at the grandeur of the sum, and not knowing what I could think of it. But I kept my eyes from her. £10, I said in my deepest voice, on purpose to have it out in comfort when she should be frightened. "What can you want with £10, child?" "That is my concern," said Lorna, plucking up her spirit at this. "When a lady asks for a loan, no gentleman pries into the cause of her asking it." "That may be as may be," I answered in a judicial manner. £10, or 20, you shall have; but I must know the purport." "Then that you never shall know, John. I am very sorry for asking you. It is not of the smallest consequence. Oh dear, no." Herewith she was running away. "Oh dear, yes," I replied, "it is of very great consequence, and I understand the whole of it. You want to give that stupid Annie, who has lost you £100,000, and who is going to be married before us, dear, God only can tell why, being my younger sister, you want to give her a wedding present; and you shall do it, darling, because it is so good of you. Don't you know your title, love? How humble you are with us humble folk. You are Lady Lorna something, so far as I can make out yet; and you ought not even to speak to us. You will go away and disdain us." "If you please, talk not like that, John. I will have nothing to do with it, if it comes between you and me, John." "You cannot help yourself," said I; and then she vowed that she could and would; and rank and birth were banished from between our lips in no time. "What can I get her good enough? I am sure I do not know," she asked. "She has been so kind and good to me, and she is such a darling. How I shall miss her, to be sure! By the by, you seem to think, John, that I shall be rich some day." "Of course you will. As rich as the French king who keeps ours. Would the Lord Chancellor trouble himself about you, if you were poor?" "Then, if I am rich, perhaps you would lend me £20, dear John. £10 would be very mean for a wealthy person to give her." To this I agreed, upon condition that I should make the purchase myself, whatever it might be. For nothing could be easier than to cheat Lorna about the cost, until time should come for her paying me. And this was better than to cheat her for the benefit of our family. For this end, and for many others, I set off to Dulverton, bearing more commissions, more messages, and more questions than a man of thrice my memory might carry so far as the corner where the saw pit is. And to make things worse, one girl or other would keep on running up to me, or even after me, when started, with something or other she had just thought of, which she could not possibly do without, and which I must be sure to remember as the most important of the whole. To my dear mother, who had partly outlived the exceeding value of trifles, the most important matter seemed to ensure Uncle Reuben's countenance and presence at the marriage; and if I succeeded in this, I might well forget all the maiden's trumpery. This she would have been wiser to tell me when they were out of hearing, for I left her to fight her own battle with them, and laughing at her predicament, promised to do the best I could for all, so far as my wits would go. Uncle Reuben was not at home, but Ruth, who received me very kindly, although without any expressions of joy, was sure of his return in the afternoon, and persuaded me to wait for him. And by the time that I had finished all I could recollect of my orders, even with paper to help me, the old gentleman rode into the yard, and was more surprised than pleased to see me. But if he was surprised, I was more than that. I was utterly astonished at the change in his appearance since the last time I had seen him. From a hale and rather heavy man, grey-haired but plump and ruddy, he was altered to a shrunken, wizened, trembling, and almost decrepit figure. Instead of curly and comely locks, grizzled indeed, but plentiful, he had only a few lank white hairs scattered and flattened upon his forehead. But the greatest change of all was in the expression of his eyes, which had been so keen and restless and bright, and a little sarcastic. Bright indeed they still were, but with a slow unhealthy lustre; their keenness was turned to perpetual outlook, their restlessness to a haggard want. As for the humour which once gleamed there, which people who fear it call sarcasm, it had been succeeded by stares of terror, and then mistrust, and shrinking. There was none of the interest in mankind, which is needful even for satire. Now what can this be, thought I to myself; has the old man lost all his property, or taken too much to strong waters? "Come inside, John Ridd," he said; "I will have a talk with you. It is cold out here, and it is too light. Come inside, John Ridd, boy." I followed him into a little dark room, quite different from Ruth Huckaback's. It was closed from the shop by an old division of boarding, hung with tan canvas, and the smell was very close and faint. Here there was a ledger desk, and a couple of chairs, and a long-legged stool. "Take the stool," said Uncle Reuben, showing me in very quietly. "It is fitter for your height, John. Wait a moment, there is no hurry." Then he slipped out by another door, and closing it quickly after him, told the foreman and waiting men that the business of the day was done; they had better all go home at once, and he would see to the fastenings. Of course they were only too glad to go; but I wondered at his sending them, with at least 2 hours of daylight left. However, that was no business of mine; and I waited, and pondered whether fair Ruth ever came into this dirty room, and if so, how she kept her hands from it. For Annie would have had it upside down in about 2 minutes, and scrubbed and brushed and dusted, until it looked quite another place; and yet all this done without scolding and crossness, which are the curse of clean women, and 10 times worse than the dustiest dust. Uncle Ben came reeling in, not from any power of liquor, but because he was stiff from horseback, and weak from work and worry. "Let me be, John, let me be," he said, as I went to help him. "This is an unkind, dreary place, but many a hundred of good gold Carolus have been turned in this place, John." "Not a doubt about it, sir," I answered in my loud and cheerful manner. "And many another hundred, sir, and may you long enjoy them." "My boy, do you wish me to die?" he asked, coming up close to my stool, and regarding me with a shrewd, though blear-eyed gaze. "Many do. Do you, John?" "Come," said I, "don't ask such nonsense. You know better than that, Uncle Ben, or else I am sorry for you. I want you to live as long as possible, for the sake of—" Here I stopped. "For the sake of what, John? I knew it is not for my own sake. For the sake of what, my boy?" "For the sake of Ruth," I answered, "if you must have all the truth. Who is to mind her when you are gone?" "But if you knew that I had gold, or a manner of getting gold, far more than ever the sailors got out of the Spanish galleons, far more than ever was heard of, and the secret was to be yours, John, yours after me and no other soul's, then you would wish me dead, John." Here he eyed me as if a speck of dust in my eyes should not escape him. "You are wrong, Uncle Ben, altogether wrong. For all the gold ever heard or dreamed of, not a wish would cross my heart to rob you of one day of life." At last he moved his eyes from mine, but without any word or sign to show whether he believed or disbelieved. Then he went to a chair, and sat with his chin upon the ledger desk, as if the effort of probing me had been too much for his weary brain. "Dreamed of! All the gold ever dreamed of! As if it were but a dream," he muttered, and then he closed his eyes to think. "Good Uncle Reuben," I said to him, "you have been a long way to day, sir. Let me go and get you a glass of good wine. Cousin Ruth knows where to find it." "How do you know how far I have been?" he asked, with a vicious look at me. "And Cousin Ruth! You are very pat with my granddaughter's name, young man." "It would be hard upon me, sir, not to know my own cousin's name." "Very well, let that go by. You have behaved very badly to Ruth. She loves you, and you love her not." At this I was so wholly amazed, not at the thing itself, I mean, but at his knowledge of it, that I could not say a single word, but looked, no doubt, very foolish. "You may well be ashamed, young man," he cried, with some triumph over me. "You are the biggest of all fools, as well as a conceited coxcomb. What can you want more than Ruth? She is a little damsel, truly, but finer men than you, John Ridd, with all your boasted strength and wrestling, have wedded smaller maidens. And as for quality, and value, bots, 1 inch of Ruth is worth all your 7 feet put together." Now I am not 7 feet high, nor ever was 6 feet 8 inches in my very prime of life, and nothing vexes me so much as to make me out a giant and above human sympathy and human scale of weakness. It cost me hard to hold my tongue, which luckily is not in proportion to my stature, and only for Ruth's sake I held it; but Uncle Ben, being old and worn, was vexed by not having any answer, almost as much as a woman is. "You want me to go on," he continued, with a look of spite at me, "about my poor Ruth's love for you, to feed your cursed vanity. Because a set of asses call you the finest man in England, there is no maid, I suppose, who is not in love with you. I believe you are as deep as you are long, John Ridd. Shall I ever get to the bottom of your character?" This was a little too much for me. Any insult I could take, with good will, from a white-haired man, and one who was my relative, unless it touched my love for Lorna, or my conscious modesty. Now both of these were touched to the quick by the sentences of the old gentleman. Therefore without a word I went, only making a bow to him. But women who are, beyond all doubt, the mothers of all mischief, also nurse that babe to sleep when he is too noisy. And there was Ruth, as I took my horse, with a trunk of frippery on him. Poor little Ruth was at the bridle, and rusting all the knops of our town going harness with tears. "Good-bye, dear," I said, as she bent her head away from me. "Shall I put you up on the saddle, dear?" "Cousin Ridd, you may take it lightly," said Ruth, turning full upon me; "and very likely you are right, according to your nature." This was the only cutting thing the little soul ever said to me. "But oh, Cousin Ridd, you have no idea of the pain you will leave behind you." "How can that be so, Ruth, when I am as good as ordered to be off the premises?" "In the first place, Cousin Ridd, grandfather will be angry with himself for having so ill used you. And now he is so weak and poorly that he is always repenting. In the next place, I shall scold him first, until he admits his sorrow; and when he has admitted it, I shall scold myself for scolding him; and then he will come round again, and think that I was hard on him, and end perhaps by hating you; for he is like a woman now, John." That last little touch of self knowledge in Ruth, which she delivered with a gleam of some secret pleasantry, made me stop and look closely at her, but she pretended not to know it. There is something in this child, I thought, very different from other girls. What it is I cannot tell, for one very seldom gets at it. At any rate, the upshot was that the good horse went back to stable, and had another feed of corn, while my wrath sank within me. There are two things, according to my experience, which may not hold with another man, fitted beyond any others to take hot tempers out of us. The first is to see our favourite creatures feeding, and licking up their food, and happily snuffling over it, yet sparing time to be grateful, and showing taste and perception. The other is to go gardening boldly, in the spring of the year, without any misgivings about it, and hoping the utmost of everything. If there be a third anodyne, approaching these two in power, it is to smoke good tobacco well, and watch the setting of the moon; and if this should only be over the sea, the result is irresistible. Master Huckaback showed no especial signs of joy at my return, but received me with a little grunt, which appeared to me to mean, "Ah, I thought he would hardly be fool enough to go." I told him how sorry I was for having in some way offended him, and he answered that I did well to grieve for one at least of my offences. To this I made no reply, as behoves a man dealing with cross and fractious people; and presently he became better tempered, and sent little Ruth for a bottle of wine. She gave me a beautiful smile of thanks for my forbearance as she passed, and I knew by her manner that she would bring the best bottle in all the cellar. As I had but little time to spare, although the days were long and light, we were forced to take our wine with promptitude and rapidity; and whether this loosened my uncle's tongue, or whether he meant beforehand to speak, is now almost uncertain. But true it is that he brought his chair very near to mine, after 3 or 4 glasses, and sent Ruth away upon some errand which seemed of small importance. At this I was vexed, for the room always looked so different without her. "Come, Jack," he said, "here's your health, young fellow, and a good and obedient wife to you. Not that your wife will ever obey you, though; you are much too easy tempered. Even a bitter and stormy woman might live in peace with you, Jack. But never you give her the chance to try. Marry some sweet little thing, if you can. If not, don't marry any. Ah, we have the maid to suit you, my lad, in this old town of Dulverton." "Have you so, sir? But perhaps the maid might have no desire to suit me." "That you may take my word she has. The colour of this wine will prove it. The little sly hussy has been to the cobwebbed arch of the cellar, where she has no right to go, for any one under a magistrate. However, I am glad to see it, and we will not spare it, John. After my time, somebody, whoever marries little Ruth, will find some rare wines there, I trow, and perhaps not know the difference." Thinking of this, the old man sighed, and expected me to sigh after him. But a sigh is not, like a yawn, infectious, and we are all more prone to be sent to sleep than to sorrow by one another. Not but what a sigh sometimes may make us think of sighing. "Well, sir," cried I, in my sprightliest manner, which rouses up most people, "here's to your health and dear little Ruth's, and may you live to knock off the cobwebs from every bottle in under the arch. Uncle Reuben, your life and health, sir?" With that I took my glass thoughtfully, for it was wondrous good, and Uncle Ben was pleased to see me dwelling pleasantly on the subject with parenthesis and self-commune and oral judgment unpronounced, though smacking of fine decision. Curia vult advisari, as the lawyers say, which means, "Let us have another glass, and then we can think about it." "Come now, John," said Uncle Ben, laying his wrinkled hand on my knee, when he saw that none could heed us, "I know that you have a sneaking fondness for my grandchild Ruth. Don't interrupt me now. You have, and to deny it will only provoke me." "I do like Ruth, sir," I said boldly, for fear of misunderstanding, "but I do not love her." "Very well, that makes no difference. Liking may very soon be loving, as some people call it, when the maid has money to help her." "But if there be, as there is in my case—" "Once for all, John, not a word. I do not attempt to lead you into any engagement with little Ruth; neither will I blame you, though I may be disappointed, if no such engagement should ever be. But whether you will have my grandchild, or whether you will not, and such a chance is rarely offered to a fellow of your standing," Uncle Ben despised all farmers, "in any case I have at least resolved to let you know my secret, and for two good reasons. The first is that it wears me out to dwell upon it all alone, and the second is that I can trust you to fulfill a promise. Moreover, you are my next of kin, except among the womankind, and you are just the man I want to help me in my enterprise." "And I will help you, sir," I answered, fearing some conspiracy, "in anything that is true and loyal and according to the laws of the realm." "Ha, ha!" cried the old man, laughing until his eyes ran over, and spreading out his skinny hands upon his shining breeches. "Thou hast gone the same fool's track as the rest, even as Spy Stickles went, and all his precious troopers. Landing of arms at Glenthorne and Lynmouth, wagons escorted across the moor, sounds of metal and booming noises. Ah, but we managed it cleverly, to cheat even those so near us. Disaffection at Taunton, signs of insurrection at Dulverton, revolutionary tanner at Dunster. We set it all abroad right well, and not even you to suspect our work, though we thought at one time that you watched us. Now who, do you suppose, is at the bottom of all this Exmoor insurgency, all this western rebellion? Not that I say there is none, mind, but who is at the bottom of it?" "Either Mother Melldrum," said I, being now a little angry, "or else old Nick himself." "Nay, old Uncle Reuben." Saying this, Master Huckaback cast back his coat and stood up, and made the most of himself. "Well," cried I, being now quite come to the limits of my intellect, "then after all Captain Stickles was right in calling you a rebel, sir." "Of course he was. Could so keen a man be wrong about an old fool like me? But come and see our rebellion, John. I will trust you now with everything. I will take no oath from you, only your word to keep silence, and most of all from your mother." "I will give you my word," I said, although liking not such pledges, which make a man think before he speaks in ordinary company, against his usual practices. However, I was now so curious, that I thought of nothing else, and scarcely could believe at all that Uncle Ben was quite right in his head. "Take another glass of wine, my son," he cried, with a cheerful countenance, which made him look more than 10 years younger. "You shall come into partnership with me. Your strength will save us 2 horses, and we always fear the horse work. Come and see our rebellion, my boy. You are a made man from to-night." "But where am I to come and see it? Where am I to find it, sir?" "Meet me," he answered, yet closing his hands, and wrinkling with doubt his forehead, "come alone, of course, and meet me at the Wizard's Slough, at 10 to-morrow morning." End of chapter 57. Recording by Michelle Harris. Chapter 58 of Lorna Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 58. Master Huckaback's Secret. Knowing Master Huckaback to be a man of his word, as well as one who would have others so, I was careful to be in good time the next morning, by the side of the wizard's slough. I am free to admit that the name of the place bore a feeling of uneasiness and a love of distance in some measure to my heart, but I did my best not to think of this, only I thought it a wise precaution, and due for the sake of my mother and Lorna, to load my gun with a dozen slugs made from the lead of the old church porch, laid by long since against witchcraft. I am well aware that some people now begin to doubt about witchcraft, or at any rate feign to do so, being desirous to disbelieve whatever they are afraid of. This spirit is growing too common among us, and will end, unless we put a stop to it, in the destruction of all religion. And as regards witchcraft, a man is bound either to believe in it, or to disbelieve the Bible. For even in the New Testament, discarding many things of the Old, such as sacrifices and Sabbath and fasting and other miseries, witchcraft is clearly spoken of as a thing that must continue, that the evil one be not utterly robbed of his vested interests. Hence let no one tell me that witchcraft is done away with, for I will meet him with St. Paul, than whom no better man and few less superstitious can be found in all the Bible. Feeling these things more in those days than I feel them now, I fetched a goodish compass round, by the way of the Cloven Rocks, rather than cross Black Barrow Down, in a reckless and unholy manner. There were several spots upon that down, cursed and smitten and blasted, as if thunderbolts had fallen there, and Satan sat to keep them warm. At any rate, it was good, as every one acknowledged, not to wander there too much, even with a doctor of divinity on one arm and of medicine upon the other. Therefore I, being all alone, and on foot, as seemed the wisest, preferred a course of roundabout, and starting about 8 o'clock, without mentioning my business, arrived at the mouth of the deep descent, such as John Fry described it. Now this, though I have not spoken of it, was not my first time of being there. For, although I could not bring myself to spy upon Uncle Reuben, as John Fry had done, yet I thought it no ill manners, after he had left our house, to have a look at the famous place, where the malefactor came to life, at least in John's opinion. At that time, however, I saw nothing except the great ugly black morass, with the grisly reeds around it, and I did not care to go very near it, much less to pry on the further side. Now, on the other hand, I was bent to get at the very bottom of this mystery, if there were any, having less fear of witch or wizard, with a man of Uncle Reuben's wealth to take my part and see me through. So I rattled the ramrod down my gun, just to know if the charge were right, after so much walking, and finding it full 6 inches deep, as I liked to have it, went boldly down the steep gorge of rock, with a firm resolve to shoot any witch, unless it were good Mother Meldrum. Nevertheless, to my surprise, all was quiet, and fair to look at, in the decline of the narrow way, with great stalked ferns coming forth like trees, yet hanging like cobwebs over one. And along one side a little spring was getting rid of its waters. Any man might stop and think, or he might go on and think, and in either case there was none to say that he was making a fool of himself. When I came to the foot of this ravine, and over against the great black slough, there was no sign of Master Huckaback, nor of any other living man, except myself, in the silence. Therefore I sat in a niche of rock, gazing at the slough, and pondering the old tradition about it. They say that, in the ancient times, a mighty necromancer lived in the wilderness of Exmoor. Here, by spell and incantation, he built himself a strong, high palace, 8-sided like a spider's web, and standing on a central steep, so that neither man nor beast could cross the moors without his knowledge. If he wished to rob and slay a traveller, or to have wild ox or stag for food, he had nothing more to do than sit at one of his 8 windows, and point his unholy book at him. Any moving creature, at which that book was pointed, must obey the call, and come from whatever distance, if sighted once by the wizard. This was a bad condition of things, and all the country groaned under it; and Exmoor, although the most honest place that a man could wish to live in, was beginning to get a bad reputation, and all through that vile wizard. No man durst even go to steal a sheep, or a pony, or so much as a deer for dinner, lest he should be brought to book by a far bigger rogue than he was. And this went on for many years, though they prayed to God to abate it. But at last, when the wizard was getting fat and haughty upon his high stomach, a mighty deliverance came to Exmoor, and a warning and a memory. For one day the sorcerer gazed from his window facing the southeast of the compass, and he yawned, having killed so many men that now he was weary of it. "Ifikins!" he cried, or some such oath, both profane and uncomely. "I see a man on the verge of the skyline, going along laboriously. A pilgrim, I trow, or some such fool, with the nails of his boots inside them. Too thin to be worth eating, but I will have him for the fun of the thing, and most of those saints have got money." With these words he stretched forth his legs on a stool, and pointed the book of heathenish spells back upwards at the pilgrim. Now this good pilgrim was plodding along, soberly and religiously, with a pound of flints in either boot, and not an ounce of meat inside him. He felt the spell of the wicked book, but only as a horse might feel a "gee wug" addressed to him. It was in the power of this good man, either to go on, or turn aside, and see out the wizard's meaning. And for a moment he halted and stood, like one in 2 minds about a thing. Then the wizard clapped one cover to, in a jocular and insulting manner, and the sound of it came to the pilgrim's ear, about 5 miles in the distance, like a great gun fired at him. "By Our Lady," he cried, "I must see to this, although my poor feet have no skin below them. I will teach this heathen miscreant how to scoff at Glastonbury." Thereupon he turned his course, and ploughed along through the moors and bogs towards the 8-sided palace. The wizard sat on his chair of comfort, and with the rankest contempt observed the holy man ploughing towards him. "He has something good in his wallet, I trow," said the black thief to himself. "These fellows get always the pick of the wine, and the best of a woman's money." Then he cried, come in, good sir," as he always did to every one. "Bad sir, I will not come in," said the pilgrim, "neither shall you come out again. Here are the bones of all you have slain, and here shall your own bones be." "Hurry me not," cried the sorcerer, "that is a thing to think about. How many miles hast thou travelled this day?" But the pilgrim was too wide awake, for if he had spoken of any number, bearing no cross upon it, the necromancer would have had him, like a ball at bando play. Therefore he answered, as truly as need be, "By the grace of Our Lady, 9." Now 9 is the crossest of all cross numbers, and full to the lips of all crochets. So the wizard staggered back, and thought, and inquired again with bravery, "Where can you find a man and wife, one going uphill and one going down, and not a word spoken between them?" "In a cucumber plant," said the modest saint, blushing even to think of it, and the wizard knew he was done for. "You have tried me with ungodly questions," continued the honest pilgrim, with one hand still over his eyes, as he thought of the feminine cucumber, "and now I will ask you a pure one. To whom of mankind have you ever done good, since God saw fit to make you?" The wizard thought, but could quote no one, and he looked at the saint, and the saint at him, and both their hearts were trembling. "Can you mention only one?" asked the saint, pointing a piece of the true cross at him, hoping he might cling to it. "Even a little child will do. Try to think of some one." The earth was rocking beneath their feet, and the palace windows darkened on them with a tint of blood, for now the saint was come inside, hoping to save the wizard. "If I must tell the pure truth," said the wizard, looking up at the arches of his windows, "I can tell of only one to whom I ever have done good." "One will do, one is quite enough. Be quick, before the ground opens. The name of one, and this cross will save you. Lay your thumb on the end of it." "Nay, that I cannot do, great saint. The devil have mercy upon me." All this while the palace was sinking, and blackness coming over them. "Thou hast all but done for thyself," said the saint, with a glory burning round his head, "by that last invocation. Yet give us the name of the one, my friend, if one there be. It will save thee, with the cross upon thy breast. All is crashing round us, dear brother. Who is that one?" "My own self," cried the wretched wizard. "Then there is no help for thee." And with that the honest saint went upward, and the wizard and all his palace, and even the crag that bore it, sank to the bowels of the earth. And over them was nothing left except a black bog fringed with reed, of the tint of the wizard's whiskers. The saint, however, was all right, after sleeping off the excitement, and he founded a chapel some 3 miles westward, and there he lies with his holy relic, and thither in after ages came, as we all come home at last, both my Lorna's Aunt Sabina and her guardian Ensor Doone. While yet I dwelled upon this strange story, wondering if it all were true, and why such things do not happen now, a man on horseback appeared as suddenly as if he had risen out of the earth, on the other side of the great black slough. At first I was a little scared, my mind being in the tune for wonders; but presently the white hair, whiter from the blackness of the bog between us, showed me that it was Uncle Reuben come to look for me that way. Then I left my chair of rock, and waved my hat and shouted to him, and the sound of my voice among the crags and lonely corners frightened me. Old Master Huckaback made no answer, but, so far as I could guess, beckoned me to come to him. There was just room between the fringe of reed and the belt of rock around it, for a man going very carefully to escape that horrible pit hole; and so I went round to the other side, and there found open space enough, with stunted bushes, and starveling trees, and straggling tufts of rushes. "You fool, you are frightened," said Uncle Ben, as he looked at my face after shaking hands. "I want a young man of steadfast courage, as well as of strength and silence; and after what I heard of the battle at Glen Doone, I thought I might trust you for courage." "So you may," said I, "wherever I see mine enemy, but not where witch and wizard be." "Tush, great fool!" cried Master Huckaback. "The only witch or wizard here is the one that bewitcheth all men. Now fasten up my horse, John Ridd, and not too near the slough, lad. Ah, we have chosen our entrance wisely. 2 good horsemen and their horses, coming hither to spy us out, are gone mining on their own account, and their last account it is, down this good wizard's bog hole." With these words Uncle Reuben clutched the mane of his horse and came down, as a man does when his legs are old, and as I myself begin to do, at this time of writing. I offered a hand, but he was vexed, and would have naught to do with it. "Now follow me, step for step," he said, when I had tethered his horse to a tree. "The ground is not death, like the wizard's hole, but many parts are treacherous. I know it well by this time." Without any more ado, he led me in and out the marshy places, to a great round hole or shaft, bratticed up with timber. I never had seen the like before, and wondered how they could want a well, with so much water on every side. Around the mouth were a few little heaps of stuff unused to the daylight, and I thought at once of the tales I had heard concerning mines in Cornwall, and the silver cup at Combe Martin, sent to the Queen Elizabeth. "We had a tree across it, John," said Uncle Reuben, smiling grimly at my sudden shrink from it; "but some rogue came spying here, just as one of our men went up. He was frightened half out of his life, I believe, and never ventured to come again. But we put the blame of that upon you, and I see that we were wrong, John." Here he looked at me with keen eyes, though weak. "You were altogether wrong," I answered. "Am I mean enough to spy upon any one dwelling with us? And more than that, Uncle Reuben, it was mean of you to suppose it." "All ideas are different," replied the old man to my heat, like a little worn out rill running down a smithy. "You with your strength and youth, and all that, are inclined to be romantic. I take things as I have known them, going on for 70 years. Now, will you come and meet the wizard, or does your courage fail you?" "My courage must be none," said I, "if I would not go where you go, sir." He said no more, but signed to me to lift a heavy wooden corb with an iron loop across it, and sunk in a little pit of earth, a yard or so from the mouth of the shaft. I raised it, and by his direction dropped it into the throat of the shaft, where it hung and shook from a great cross beam laid at the level of the earth. A very stout thick rope was fastened to the handle of the corb, and ran across a pulley hanging from the centre of the beam, and thence out of sight in the nether places. "I will first descend," he said. "Your weight is too great for safety. When the bucket comes up again, follow me, if your heart is good." Then he whistled down, with a quick sharp noise, and a whistle from below replied; and he clomb into the vehicle, and the rope ran through the pulley, and Uncle Ben went merrily down, and was out of sight, before I had time to think of him. Now, being left on the bank like that, and in full sight of the goodly heaven, I wrestled hard with my flesh and blood, about going down into the pit hole. And but for the pale shame of the thing, that a white-headed man should adventure so, and green youth doubt about it, never could I have made up my mind, for I do love air and heaven. However, at last up came the bucket, and with a short sad prayer I went into whatever might happen. My teeth would chatter, do all I could, but the strength of my arms was with me, and by them I held on the grimy rope, and so eased the foot of the corb, which threatened to go away fathoms under me. Of course I should still have been safe enough, being like an egg in an egg cup, too big to care for the bottom. Still I wished that all should be done, in good order, without excitement. The scoopings of the side grew black, and the patch of sky above more blue, as with many thoughts of Lorna. A long way underground I sank. Then I was fetched up at the bottom with a jerk and rattle, and but for holding by the rope so, must have tumbled over. 2 great torches of bale resin showed me all the darkness, one being held by Uncle Ben, and the other by a short square man with a face which seemed well known to me. "Hail to the world of gold, John Ridd," said Master Huckaback, smiling in the old dry manner. "Bigger coward never came down the shaft, now did he, Carfax?" "They be all alike," said the short square man. "Fust time they doos it." "May I go to heaven," I cried, which is a thing quite out of sight (for I always have a vein of humour, too small to be followed by any one), "if ever again of my own accord I go so far away from it." Uncle Ben grinned less at this than at the way I knocked my shin in getting out of the bucket; and as for Master Carfax, he would not even deign to smile; and he seemed to look upon my entrance as an interloping. For my part, I had naught to do, after rubbing my bruised leg, except to look about me, so far as the dullness of light would help. And herein I seemed, like a mouse in a trap, able no more than to run to and fro, and knock himself, and stare at things. For here was a little channel grooved with posts on either side of it, and ending with a heap of darkness, whence the sight came back again, and there was a scooped place, like a funnel, but pouring only to darkness. So I waited for somebody to speak first, not seeing my way to anything. "You seem to be disappointed, John," said Uncle Reuben, looking blue by the light of the flambeau. "Did you expect to see the roof of gold, and the sides of gold, and the floor of gold, John Ridd?" "Ha, ha!" cried Master Carfax. "I reckon her did. No doubt her did." "You are wrong," I replied; "but I did expect to see something better than dirt and darkness." "Come on then, my lad, and we will show you something better. We want your great arm on here, for a job that has beaten the whole of us." With these words Uncle Ben led the way along a narrow passage, roofed with rock and floored with slate-colored shale and shingle, and winding in and out, until we stopped at a great stone block or boulder, lying across the floor, and as large as my mother's best oaken wardrobe. Beside it were several sledge-hammers, battered, and some with broken helves. "Thou great villain!" cried Uncle Ben, giving the boulder a little kick. "I believe thy time is come at last. Now, John, give us a sample of the things they tell of thee. Take the biggest of them sledge-hammers, and crack this rogue in two for us. We have tried at him for a fortnight, and he is a nut worth cracking. But we have no man who can swing that hammer, though all in the mine have handled it." "I will do my very best," said I, pulling off my coat and waistcoat, as if I were going to wrestle. "But I fear he will prove too tough for me." "Ay, that her wull," grunted Master Carfax. "Lack'tha a Carnishman, and a beg one too, not a little charp such as I be. There be no man outside Carnwall as can crack that boulder." "Bless my heart," I answered, "but I know something of you, my friend, or at any rate of your family. Well, I have beaten most of your Cornish men, though not my place to talk of it. But mind, if I crack this rock for you, I must have some of the gold inside it." "Dost think to see the gold come tumbling out like the kernel of a nut, thou zany?" asked Uncle Ben pettishly. "Now wilt thou crack it, or wilt thou not? For I believe thou canst do it, though only a lad of Somerset." Uncle Reuben showed by saying this, and by his glance at Carfax, that he was proud of his county, and would be disappointed for it if I failed to crack the boulder. So I begged him to stoop his torch a little, that I might examine my subject. To me there appeared to be nothing at all remarkable about it, except that it sparkled here and there, when the flash of the flame fell upon it. A great, obstinate, oblong, sullen stone. How could it be worth the breaking, except for making roads with? Nevertheless, I took up the hammer, and swinging it far behind my head, fetched it down, with all my power, upon the middle of the rock. The roof above rang mightily, and the echo went down delven galleries, so that all the miners flocked to know what might be doing. But Master Carfax only smiled, although the blow shook him where he stood, for behold the stone was still unbroken, and as firm as ever. Then I smote it again, with no better fortune, and Uncle Ben looked vexed and angry, but all the miners grinned with triumph. "This little tool is too light," I cried. "One of you give me a piece of strong cord." Then I took two more of the weightiest hammers, and lashed them fast to the back of mine, not so as to strike, but to burden the fall. Having made this firm, and with room to grasp the handle of the largest one only, for the helves of the others were shorter, I smiled at Uncle Ben, and whirled the mighty implement round my head, just to try whether I could manage it. Upon that the miners gave a cheer, being honest men, and desirous of seeing fair play between this shameless stone, as Dan Homer calls it, and me with my hammer hammering. Then I swung me on high to the swing of the sledge, as a thresher bends back to the rise of his flail, and with all my power descending delivered the ponderous onset. Crashing and crushed, the great stone fell over, and threads of sparkling gold appeared in the jagged sides of the breakage. "How now, Simon Carfax," cried Uncle Ben triumphantly, "wilt thou find a man in Cornwall can do the like of that?" "Ay, and more," he answered. "However, it be pretty fair for a lad of these outlandish parts. Get your rollers, my lads, and lead it to the crushing engine." I was glad to have been of some service to them, for it seems that this great boulder had been too large to be drawn along the gallery, and too hard to crack. But now they moved it very easily, taking piece by piece, and carefully picking up the fragments. "Thou hast done us a good turn, my lad," said Uncle Reuben, as the others passed out of sight at the corner. "And now I will show thee the bottom of a very wondrous mystery. But we must not do it more than once, for the time of day is the wrong one." The whole affair being a mystery to me, and far beyond my understanding, I followed him softly, without a word, yet thinking very heavily, and longing to be above ground again. He led me through small passages, to a hollow place near the descending shaft, where I saw a most extraordinary monster fitted up. In form it was like a great coffee mill, such as I had seen in London, only 1,000 times larger, and with heavy windlass to work it. "Put in a barrow load of the smoulder," said Uncle Ben to Carfax, "and let them work the crank, for John to understand a thing or two." "At this time of day?" cried Simon Carfax. "And the watching as has been o' late?" However, he did it without more remonstrance, pouring into the scuttle at the top of the machine about a basketful of broken rock; and then a dozen men went to the wheel, and forced it round, as sailors do. Upon that such a hideous noise arose as I never should have believed any creature capable of making, and I ran to the well of the mine for air, and to ease my ears, if possible. "Enough, enough!" shouted Uncle Ben, by the time I was nearly deafened. "We will digest our goodly boulder after the devil is come abroad for his evening work. Now, John, not a word about what you have learned; but henceforth you will not be frightened by the noise we make at dusk." I could not deny but what this was very clever management. If they could not keep the echoes of the upper air from moving, the wisest plan was to open their valves during the discouragement of the falling evening, when folk would rather be driven away, than drawn into, the wilds and quagmires, by a sound so deep and awful, coming through the darkness. End of chapter 58. Recording by Michelle Harris.